You think that the most painful betrayal comes from an enemy. You're wrong. It comes from your own blood. Early that morning, the heavy, rhythmic thud of a fist against my front door shattered the silence of my home. Opening the door, I faced a ruthless eviction notice with my name on it. Across the street, Ansgar, my son-in-law, was leaning against a brand new Porsche, laughing and holding up his phone to record me like a defeated man. Beside him was Gisela, my own daughter, the baby I once carried on my shoulders, whose tuition and lavish parties I paid for stood there with a cold, satisfied expression. They thought I was a senile old man, easily stripped of this 2-hectare estate by a fraudulent signature. But they forgot one thing. I am Albrecht, a former chief petroleum engineer. I have managed billion-dollar oil rigs in the middle of a lethal ocean. I do not panic. I calculate and destroy threats. I didn't yell or beg. I calmly looked at the papers and asked one question. Officer, do you know this estate was locked in an irrevocable blind trust years ago, and your presence here today is evidence of the federal bank fraud my son-in-law just committed? Immediately, Consta's face went pale, and that was only the beginning of the hell my children dug for themselves. The rich, dark aroma of freshly brewed coffee was the only thing keeping the world steady that morning. I stood in my kitchen, a space I had designed with surgical precision, watching the Munich sun crawl over the horizon. It painted the Bavarian sky in violent shades of burnt orange and deep violet, a beautiful, isolated piece that I had shared with my late wife for over 30 years. My 2-hectare estate was supposed to be my final fortress, a reward for 40 years of sweat and iron in the North Sea. But that piece didn't just break, it was detonated. The heavy, rhythmic thud of a fist against my front door shattered the silence. It wasn't a neighborly knock, it was the sound of authority, relentless and cold. I set my ceramic mug down on the granite counter, my calloused hands that had tightened bolts on billion-dollar oil rigs, wiping themselves dry on a towel. When I opened the heavy oak door, I didn't see a friend. I saw police officer Consta. I knew the boy. He'd grown up just a few miles down the road, a decent kid who'd once looked at me with respect. Today, he couldn't even meet my eyes. He shifted his weight, his uniform looking a size too large for his nervous frame, clutching a manila folder against his chest like a shield. Herr Albrecht, he started, his voice tight and formal, I am truly sorry to have to do this to you. He held out a thick stack of legal papers. The bold black letters at the top screamed, Court ordered Norta of eviction. The paper felt unnervingly heavy in my hands, laden with a betrayal so deep it felt like a physical weight. I didn't look at the fine print yet. My eyes drifted past the sweating officer, out toward the sprawling green lawn I had meticulously cared for since the day I retired. Parked illegally across the street, its tires biting into the grass, was a gleaming, midnight black Porsche. Leaning casually against the hood was Ansgar, my son-in-law. He was dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, looking every bit the self-proclaimed tech entrepreneur he pretended to be. He was holding his smartphone high, the camera lens pointed directly at my face, a cruel, echoing laugh tearing through the crisp morning air. "Hurry up, old man," Ansgar shouted across the pavement, his grin wide and venomous. "Get your bags packed. I told you your time was up. This house is ours now." Standing right beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, was Gisela, my daughter. The little girl I had carried on my shoulders through these very fields. The woman whose university tuition, lavish wedding, and endless financial emergencies I had quietly funded for a decade without asking for a single cent in return. She wore a pristine white blazer, her makeup flawless and mask-like. She was a real estate agent. She knew exactly how the laws worked. She avoided my gaze, staring instead at the front steps I had built with my own 2 hands 30 years ago. There was a satisfied curve to her lips that told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't just a bystander. She was the architect of this nightmare. They thought they had backed a helpless, grieving old man into a corner. They thought my kindness was a terminal weakness. They made a catastrophic miscalculation. In my professional life, I was a chief engineer. I was responsible for offshore platforms the size of small cities in the middle of a lethal, unforgiving ocean. My job was to analyze complex structures, anticipate failures before they happened, and mitigate risks that could end in an explosion. I am trained to spot a structural flaw from a mile away, whether it's in a deep water drilling valve or in the greedy souls of the people standing in front of me. I do not panic. I calculate. I survive. The fatherly that had lingered in my chest for Gisela evaporated instantly. The man who had patiently funded their extravagant lifestyles was gone. They wanted to play a ruthless game of corporate theft. Fine. They had just invited a veteran shark to the table. I turned my attention back to Consta. The poor kid was holding his breath, bracing for the screaming, the tears, or the desperate begging that usually accompanied an eviction. I slowly adjusted my glasses and calmly reviewed the first page. It stated the property had been foreclosed upon by Sutton Holding, Ansgar's primary corporate entity. I let out a soft, dry chuckle. It was the sound of a man who had just found the crack in the enemy's armor. Consta blinked, thoroughly confused by my lack of terror. I tapped the heavy paper with my index finger and finally broke the silence. "Si quan consta," I said, my voice steady, deep, and completely devoid of fear. "I have a very simple question for you before you proceed with this circus." He nodded quickly, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Go ahead, Herr Albrecht." I pointed toward the official seal on the document. This eviction notice was filed by Sutton Holding, claiming full ownership of my land. But tell me, son, are you aware that this entire 2-hectare property was locked securely into an irrevocable blind trust back in 2018? Selling it, transferring it, or leveraging it is legally impossible for anyone, including myself. Consta's brow furrowed. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping into a dangerous whisper. "So, I need you to tell me exactly what forged, fraudulent piece of trash my son-in-law used to bypass a judge and get you standing on my porch today." Consta stopped breathing. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like he might pass out right there on my welcome mat. His hand drifted unconsciously away from his belt. He realized in a terrifying second that he wasn't executing a routine property removal. He had just been weaponized in a massive crime, and he was standing right in the blast zone. "Sir, I just process the orders the clerk hands me," he stammered, his voice dropping to a nervous whisper. "The paperwork had a signature. It looked standard." I offered him a steady, reassuring nod, though my eyes remained cold as ice. "I know you do. But standard paperwork does not apply to assets secured in an irrevocable blind trust. A judge would only sign this if someone presented a deed proving a legal transfer. And since I cannot legally transfer this land, whoever filed this order committed perjury and presented forged documents to a court." Across the street, Ansgar's arrogant smile was beginning to falter. He couldn't hear us, but he could see the shift in Consta's posture. He shouted again, his voice cracking with a hint of desperation. "What's the hold-up, Consta? Toss him out." I looked at the young officer, whose hands were now visibly trembling as he gripped the folder. "Do not radio this in yet," I commanded softly. "Do not approach that vehicle. Just stand here on the porch with me for a moment. Let them think they have won." Consta nodded slowly, turning his back to the street so Ansgar and Gisela couldn't see the sheer panic written across his face. I stood there, leaning against the doorframe of the house I had built, watching my own daughter celebrate my ruin. My mind drifted back to the night this nightmare truly began. A rainy night 4 months ago when they showed up at my door, dripping with fake tears and manipulative lies. They thought they had executed the perfect crime. They believed I was a senile old man who was too trusting for his own good. They didn't realize that every move they made was being logged into my internal database. They didn't realize that while they were planning to bulldoze my home, I was already building a legal gallows for them. "You're doing great, Constar," I whispered, my gaze fixed on the silver Porsche. "Just hold that folder. The higher they climb on their mountain of lies, the more bones they'll break when I finally pull the ground out from under them." The trap was set. The pressure was building, and I was the only one who knew exactly when the entire system was going to explode. To understand the absolute depth of their depravity, you have to look past the eviction notice and the flashing police lights. You have to go back to the night this nightmare was born, a night that proved a daughter's tears can be more corrosive than any chemical I ever handled on an oil rig. It was exactly 4 months ago, on a Tuesday in late November, when the sky over Munich decided to tear itself apart. A fierce Bavarian storm had been brewing all afternoon, lashing the windows of my study with an intensity that felt personal. I was sitting in my leather recliner, the only thing grounding me in a house that felt too quiet since my wife passed away. I was reading a technical engineering journal by the warm glow of a desk lamp, finding comfort in the rigid, predictable laws of physics. Then the doorbell rang. Not a polite chime, but a frantic, desperate pounding that shattered the silence of my sanctuary. When I pulled open the heavy oak door, the wind howled like a wounded animal, blowing rain onto my hardwood floors. Standing there, soaked to the bone and looking entirely broken, were Gisela and Ansgar. My daughter was shivering uncontrollably, her expensive coat clinging to her shoulders, her mascara running down her face in dark, messy streaks. Ansgar looked like a man who had been dragged through hell. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his eyes were red-rimmed and frantic. "Dad, please," Gisela choked out, her voice barely a whisper against the thunder. I didn't ask questions. My instincts as a father, the same instincts that made me want to shield her from every cold wind for 38 years, took over. I ushered them into the kitchen, wrapped them in warm towels, and set a kettle on the stove. Gisela sat at the head of my wide oak table, her shoulders shaking with heavy, dramatic sobs. Ansgar sat opposite her, gripping a mug of tea as if it were the only thing keeping him on this earth. He stared at the polished wood, playing the role of a defeated man to absolute perfection. "Ansgar, tell me what happened," I said, my voice steady, though a knot of concern was tightening in my chest. He took a shuddering breath, looking at me with eyes full of fabricated despair. "The company, Albrecht. It's over. A former business partner, a man I trusted, filed a malicious lawsuit against the startup. The court issued an automatic injunction. Everything is frozen. My corporate accounts, our personal savings, every cent we have is locked behind a legal wall." He painted a terrifying picture of impending ruin. He claimed that without a massive survival loan from the bank within the week, they would face absolute bankruptcy, lose their home, and be left with nothing but the clothes on their backs. He used complex financial jargon, speaking of catastrophic collapses and legal hemorrhaging, projecting a vulnerability I had never seen in him. But the real strike came from my own blood. Gisela reached across the table, her cold, damp fingers clutching my hands with a desperation that felt devastatingly real. "Dad, we've tried every door. They're all slammed in our faces. The bank won't even look at us because of the injunction. We're going to be out on the street." Then she delivered the killing blow. She looked me in the eye, tears streaming freely, and whispered the one thing she knew I couldn't resist. "Mom always told you to protect me, Dad. She made you promise on her deathbed that you would never let me fall. Please, don't let us lose everything." Hearing her invoke her mother's memory was like taking a physical blow to the chest. My beautiful wife had been the heart of this family. In her final days, holding my hand in that sterile hospital room, she had made me swear to look out for our little girl. Gisela knew that promise was the iron core of my life. She didn't just push a button, she weaponized my grief with surgical, ruthless precision. "I'll help you," I said, my protective instincts drowning out any analytical skepticism. "I can liquidate some funds. I can write you a check today." Ansgar shook his head quickly, running a nervous hand through his damp hair. "Cash won't solve the structural problem, Albrecht. The bank examiners need to see long-term, appreciating collateral backing my corporate portfolio. They need a solid, tangible asset on the books to approve the funding." I frowned. My engineering mind flickered a red flag. "I won't risk this property, Ansgar. This estate is my sanctuary. It's the legacy I'm leaving behind." No, you misunderstand," Ansgar insisted, holding his hands up defensively. "We don't want ownership. We'd never ask for that. We just want to establish a family limited liability company, LLC. It's a standard financial vehicle. We temporarily park the management rights of the property under this holding company. It shows up as equity on my balance sheet. The bank approves the loan. And here's the best part. It helps you avoid massive estate taxes when you pass away." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, spinning a web of asset protection shields and fiduciary buffers. It sounded remarkably sophisticated, like the legitimate tax strategies utilized by wealthy families across the country. "Nothing changes for you," Gisela promised, squeezing my hands. "You keep living here exactly as you always have. You're just saving our lives in the process." I looked at my daughter, seeing the terrified child I had raised, completely unaware that I was looking at a predator setting a trap. I agreed. I thought I was honoring my wife. I had no idea I was signing my own death warrant. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a deceptively bright sky. Ansgar arrived at my gravel driveway with a man he introduced as his corporate notary, a nervous, sweaty individual named Parvo. Parvo wore a cheap, ill-fitting grey suit that smelled of stale cigarettes, clutching a leather briefcase to his chest as if it contained state secrets. Normally, my instincts would have flared at such an unprofessional character, but my mind was clouded by the image of Gisela's tears. I was exhausted, playing the role of the grieving, helpful father. Ansgar guided Parvo to my dining table, where they spread out a formidable stack of legal documents, at least 50 pages of dense, single-spaced text. "Just the standard boilerplate for the LLC, Albrecht," Ansgar said, his tone smooth and deeply respectful. "I've marked the signature lines with yellow tabs to make it easy." I sat down, picking up the heavy brass pen Parvo set before me. I read the first few pages carefully. They detailed the formation of the family corporation and my role as a passive beneficiary. It was exactly what we had discussed, a bureaucratic maneuver to save their business. Seeing that legitimate language at the start lulled me into a false sense of absolute security. I allowed my fatigue and my paternal devotion to override my decades of analytical training. "Just initial the bottom of each page," Ansgar urged softly, hovering over my shoulder with a tense, coiled energy. I began to sign. The rhythmic scratching of the pen filled the quiet kitchen. I thought about Rachel's pleas. I thought about the promise to my wife. I believed I was performing a noble, selfless act to rescue my child. I was blissfully unaware of the lethal document, slipped expertly into the center of the stack. Buried between pages of meaningless corporate bylaws and tax indemnification clauses was a single, devastating sheet of paper, a quitclaim deed. By signing that specific page, I wasn't transferring management rights. I was legally surrendering all ownership, all equity, and every right to my 2-hectare sanctuary directly to Ansgar's holding company. I was giving away the home I built with my own 2 hands to a predator, receiving nothing but a lie in return. I didn't read that page. My eyes were tired, my heart was heavy, and I simply trusted my family. I signed my name exactly where the bright yellow tab instructed me, locking the trap shut around my own ankle. The moment my pen lifted from the final line, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The thick tension that had surrounded Ansgar vanished, replaced by a sudden, chilling euphoria. He practically snatched the papers from the table before the ink was even dry. Parvo began stamping the documents with frantic speed, his hands moving with professional efficiency to seal the betrayal. Ansgar reached out and grabbed my shoulder, squeezing it with an intensity that felt less like gratitude and more like violent triumph. "Albrecht, you have saved us," he proclaimed, his voice ringing a little too loudly in the quiet house. "You have no idea what you've just done for our future." He didn't stay for coffee. He didn't discuss the lawsuit further. He packed the documents with incredible haste and rushed out the door. Later that afternoon, Gisela called me. The hysterical, trembling woman from the night before was gone. Her voice was bright, remarkably untroubled, and dripping with a satisfaction she couldn't quite hide. She thanked me, mentioned the bank had pre-approved the loan, and hung up. She sounded so completely fine that a tiny, cold seed of doubt planted itself in the back of my mind. It was a whisper from my analytical brain, the one that had spent 40 years calculating pressure thresholds. Human emotions do not recover from total devastation that quickly. I looked out my window at the lawn I had cared for over 3 decades. I felt a sudden, inexplicable shiver. I had no idea that I had just legally erased myself from my own home. I was still the chief engineer, but I had just ignored the most critical warning light of my life. The betrayal was complete. The clock on my destruction had been activated, and as I stood in my silent kitchen, I realized the storm outside might have ended, but the one inside my family was just beginning to howl. The Munich sun was deceptively warm that Tuesday afternoon, beating down on the back of my neck as I knelt in the soft soil of my front garden. I was carefully pruning the antique rose bushes my late wife had planted during our first spring in this house. Gardening had become my quiet meditation since she passed, a way to keep my hands busy and my mind anchored to a world that still made sense. I was dusting the dirt from my heavy work gloves when a flash of neon yellow caught the corner of my eye. I stood up slowly, my joints aching with a familiar stiffness, and squinted against the glare. About 50 meters away, near the heavy iron gates of my estate, stood a man I had never seen before. He wore a high-visibility vest, a white hard hat, and was adjusting a sophisticated digital theodolite on a bright yellow tripod. My initial thought was that he was a municipal worker checking public water lines. I grabbed my wooden walking stick and made my way across the lawn to offer a polite correction. As I approached, the man offered a professional nod. "Good afternoon, sir," he called out. "Beautiful piece of land you have here." "Thank you," I replied, my voice steady. "I take pride in it, but I have to ask what brings you onto private residential property? The public easement ends 30 feet back." The surveyor offered a confused, slightly apologetic smile as he tapped a rugged tablet. "I apologize if I'm intruding, sir, but I'm not with the city. I'm a private contractor hired by the bank. I was dispatched to conduct a topographic survey and a commercial appraisal of this specific parcel." My heart executed a slow, heavy drop, but my posture remained rigid. An engineer does not react to an anomaly by shouting, he gathers data. "A commercial appraisal?" I asked, a cold chill radiating from my spine. "This is a single-family home. There is no commercial business here." The surveyor looked at his tablet, then back at me with profound discomfort, as if speaking to a confused child. "Sir, according to the bank files, this entire plot is being evaluated for a massive commercial redevelopment project. The primary applicant is Sutton Holdings, LLC. They've ordered a complete demolition of all existing structures. They're tearing this house down to break ground on a luxury strip mall next month. The afternoon breeze suddenly felt like ice. The world lost its sound, the birds, the distant traffic, the rustling leaves, all faded into a muted, ringing silence. My mind, trained for decades to process catastrophic system failures, began compiling this devastating new data. Project Sanctuary. That was the name on his digital screen. They hadn't asked for management rights to protect my legacy. They had systematically manipulated me into surrendering my home so they could bulldoze it into the dirt for a payout. I forced a violent storm of rage deep into the bottom of my stomach, locking it behind a vault of iron self-control. "I see," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I am the man who built that house. I appreciate the clarity. Please finish your work." Every step back to the porch felt like walking across a battlefield. I didn't sit in my rocking chair. I went straight to my study and picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over Gisela's contact. Part of me, the father, wanted to believe this was a mistake. The other part, the engineer, knew the pressure readings were off. I pressed call. It rang 4 times before she picked up. The background noise was chaotic. It wasn't an office. I heard the clinking of crystal, relaxed laughter, and the smooth hum of jazz. "Gisela," I said, keeping my voice level, "there's a surveyor on my lawn. He says Sutton Holdings is planning a demolition for a strip mall." There was a brief pause. I heard her cover the microphone. When she spoke again, her tone was dripping with that condescending sweetness reserved for the senile. "Dad," she sighed, a sound of manufactured exhaustion, "you're getting confused again. I told you about this. It's just a routine tax appraisal for the family company. Don't worry your old head about it. Go back to your gardening." In the background, a cheerful voice announced, "Fresh powder on the summit." They were at a luxury ski resort in Aspen. "Gisela," I continued, "tax appraisers don't use commercial redevelopment blueprints." Her voice instantly tightened, losing its sugary coating. "Dad, honestly, you're overthinking this. The bank just uses generic commercial forms. Ansgar is handling the complex stuff, so you don't have to stress. We're in an important meeting with investors. Go make some tea. I love you." The line went dead. I lowered the phone. A profound, chilling clarity washed over me. For 35 years, I had identified anomalies. A microscopic hairline fracture in a pressure valve leads to an explosion. You never ignore the data. Data point 1. 4 months ago, Ansgar swore they were bankrupt. Data point 2. 2 weeks ago, Ansgar pulled into my driveway in a brand new Porsche. Data point 3. Gisela was sipping cocktails in Aspen while claiming to be in a meeting. The math didn't add up. They weren't drowning. They were flush with cash, my cash. They had used my grief as a psychological crowbar to pry the deed out of my hands. "I need the raw data," I whispered to the empty room. I drove 40 minutes to their upscale rented townhouse. I brought a stack of misdelivered mail as an excuse, but I knew the house would be empty. They were in Aspen, celebrating my ruin. I parked 2 houses down. The neighborhood was painfully quiet. I didn't go to the front door. I walked down the side path to the backyard alley where 3 large municipal bins stood behind a privacy fence. In the engineering world, when you suspect malfeasance, you audit the waste. I lifted the lid of the recycling bin. Beneath expensive wine bottles and takeout containers, I found 2 tightly tied grocery bags of paper waste. I grabbed them, tossed them into my truck, and drove away without looking back. Back at home, I pushed the coffee table aside and spread a large canvas drop cloth. The first bag was junk mail. The second was a mound of cross-cut paper shreds. Ansgar had used a heavy-duty shredder, but he had underestimated the patience of a man who spent his life piecing together shattered systems. I sat cross-legged on the floor with clear adhesive tape, tweezers, and a desk lamp. Hour after hour, I sorted blue ink fragments, black ink, red corporate letterheads. By midnight, a terrifying picture formed. The first document I assembled was an email chain, subject, Project Sanctuary Acquisition. They had jokingly named the demolition project after the very word I used to describe my home. But the most damning evidence was a multi-page financial prospectus. I taped the final corner and read the bold text. A commercial development plan budgeted at €3.5 million. It listed my address, my property lines. It detailed the plan to level the residential structures, clear the ancient oak trees, and pave a concrete parking lot for a high-end retail chain. Demolition date, less than 30 days. I sat back on my heels, staring until the letters blurred. This wasn't a last-minute attempt to save a startup. It was a premeditated, highly orchestrated corporate heist. The emails I pieced together dated back 8 months. They had been planning this long before that rainy night they showed up weeping on my porch. Gisella's tears, Ansgar's frantic pacing, the invocation of my dead wife's memory. It was all a rehearsed theatrical performance designed to exploit my heart while they bypassed my brain. They had slipped a real quitclaim deed into a stack of fake management papers. They stole my life's work while smiling at me. I looked at my hands. They were shaking, not with age, but with a cold, kinetic fury. "You think I'm a ghost haunting this property?" I whispered to the reconstructed documents. "You think I'm just a liability to be cleared?" A loving, trusting father who wanted to protect his little girl died right there on that study floor. What rose from the canvas drop cloth was the chief engineer. I was no longer investigating a failure. I was preparing for a controlled demolition of my own. I carefully gathered the taped documents and locked them in my heavy steel safe. I erased every trace of my investigation. I had to maintain the illusion. I had to be the oblivious, deteriorating old man they expected. I walked into the kitchen and poured the cold remnants of my coffee down the sink. My reflection in the window was sharp, focused, and utterly devoid of mercy. If Ansgar and Gisela wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate theft, they were about to find out what happens when you sabotage a system built by a veteran. I didn't need a family lawyer. I needed a shark. I opened my leather contact book to a name I hadn't called in a decade, a man who didn't negotiate settlements but annihilated opponents. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and I was going to make sure that when the trap snapped shut, there wouldn't even be enough of them left to bury. A system is only as strong as its weakest component. For decades, I had managed offshore oil rigs where a single microscopic fracture in a high-pressure valve could trigger a catastrophic explosion. I was trained to never ignore the data, no matter how much the heart wished the readings were wrong. My daughter, Gisela, and her husband, Ansgar, were the structural failure in my life. They had weaponized my grief and my late wife's memory to steal my sanctuary, but they made one fatal assumption. They thought I was a dying fire, a flickering light easily extinguished. They didn't realize I was the one who designed the furnace. The loving father who had once carried Gisela on his shoulders died the moment I pieced together those shredded documents in my study. What rose from the floor was the chief engineer. I was no longer a victim. I was a hunter, and I was staring directly at my prey. I knew I couldn't fight a multi-million euro corporate heist with just a stack of taped-together trash. I needed a professional who understood the dark mechanics of fraud, a legal shark who didn't negotiate but annihilated. I reached into my leather contact book and dialed a number I hadn't touched in a decade. The meeting took place on the 42nd floor of a glass and steel monolith in downtown Munich. The brass plaque on the heavy oak doors read, "Wolfram, Corporate Litigation and Asset Recovery." Wolfram was a man carved from granite, with predatory eyes that analyzed me with the cold precision of a forensic scientist. I sat in his leather chair and placed a thick envelope on his desk. It contained the coordinates, the corporate registration numbers, and the reconstructed blueprints I had pulled from Ansgar's garbage. Most men your age would be entirely broken by this betrayal, Wolfram observed, his voice a low, commanding baritone. You do not look broken. You look like a man who is preparing for war. I am an engineer, I replied, my voice steady and devoid of the tremor I had been practicing for my daughter. I have discovered a catastrophic structural failure. I want you to dismantle their operation, freeze their assets, and salt the earth beneath them. I want them ruined forever. Wolfram didn't counsel me on family forgiveness. Instead, he pulled a certified document from a folder, the quitclaim deed they had tricked me into signing. He pointed to my signature. They filed this exactly one day after they sat at your kitchen table. It is a textbook case of fraudulent execution. Then came the second strike. Wolfram slid a stack of redacted banking files across the desk. Ansgar took this void deed directly to the bank. He used the total equity of your 2-hectare estate to secure an immediate cash loan of €2.8 million. The money was already in an offshore account. That explained the Porsche. That explained their lavish lifestyle while they claimed to be bankrupt. By presenting a fraudulently obtained deed to a bank, they hadn't just stolen my land. They had committed federal bank fraud. They had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them. What is our tactical approach? I asked. We build an impenetrable fortress of evidence, Wolfram replied, with a razor-thin smile. But while I trace the money, you go back home. Continue to play the failing, confused father. Let them believe they are the smartest people in the room. We will let them dig their own graves right up until the moment we bury them. The next morning, I began the meticulous performance of my own cognitive decline. It was psychological warfare. When Gisela came over under the guise of bringing me lunch, I intentionally called her by her late mother's name. I saw the flash of triumph in her eyes, a sickening glint of victory masked by feigned sympathy. I escalated the act. I left my heavy brass keyring in the refrigerator next to the milk, ensuring Ansgar would find it. I watched from the hallway as he pulled the cold keys out, shaking his head and muttering a cruel joke about my expiring brain. I complained of phantom chest pains and shallow breathing, clutching my heart while Gisela watched with a mask of concern that didn't reach her cold eyes. They completely bought the illusion. In their greedy minds, a senile, physically failing father would never possess the mental acuity to challenge them. They stopped monitoring my movements. They simply left me alone, to wither, assuming the battle was already won. But I needed one final piece of raw data. I needed to know the true depth of their malice. I purchased a military-grade, voice-activated micro-recorder, smaller than a matchbook and virtually undetectable. I called Gisela, my voice wheezing and ragged. I'm having a terrible day. My chest feels tight. Please, come have tea with your old father. She arrived an hour later, carrying an oversized, expensive designer handbag, a trophy purchased with the bank's stolen millions. She looked at my disheveled appearance with supreme satisfaction. I led her to the kitchen, my steps painfully slow. I poured the tea with a shaking wrist, intentionally spilling a puddle on the counter. "Oh, look what I've done," I muttered, dropping my head in feigned embarrassment. Gisela sighed, a sound of profound irritation. She placed her luxurious bag on the kitchen island, safely away from the spill. "Just sit down before you hurt yourself, Dad," she snapped, wiping the counter with aggressive efficiency. When she left the room to use the restroom, I moved with the fluid grace of a man 30 years younger. I stepped to the island, reached into the cosmetic pocket of her bag, and dropped the micro-recorder into the silk lining. By the time she returned, I was back in my chair, staring blankly at my cold tea. She sprinted out the door shortly after, carrying my digital spy directly into the heart of their criminal operation. That night, I sat alone in the shadows of my study. The only light was the steady green glow of the audio receiver on my desk. I poured a measure of bourbon, leaned back, and turned the volume dial. The audio was flawlessly clear. I heard them laughing. I heard the clinking of glasses as they toasted to my destruction. But then the conversation shifted to something infinitely darker. Once the sheriff drags him out, dump him in that cheap state facility, Gisela's voice projected, cold and calculated. And the heart medication? Ansgar's voice asked. Cancel the premium prescriptions, she replied without a second of hesitation. He's 70, Ansgar. Without the good meds, his heart will give out in a month. We keep the money, the developers bulldoze the house, and we are finally free. The malice in her voice hung in the quiet room like a poisonous gas. My own daughter was calmly negotiating the timeline of my death for a commercial payout. Any remaining shard of paternal mercy in my soul was instantly pulverized into dust. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I felt a cold, structural logic settle over me. They thought I was a ghost haunting a property they had already conquered. They didn't realize that the senile old man was actually the executioner. I picked up the phone and called Wolfram. The trap is ready, I said, my voice as hard as the steel rigs I used to command. They aren't just thieves, they are predators. It's time to show them what happens when the prey is the one holding the trigger. The fortress was built. The evidence was ironclad. And as the moon climbed over my estate, I realized that the 2.8 million euro they had stolen was secured against a ghost asset. They had mortgaged their freedom for a property they could never legally own. I finished my bourbon and looked out at the dark lawn. The bulldozers would never arrive, but the federal agents would, and I would be right there on the porch to watch the structure of their lives collapse into the dirt. The morning sun was a cold, indifferent witness to the scene unfolding on my front porch. I stood perfectly still, watching Officer Conster shift his weight, his hand hovering near his holster as he clutched the fraudulent eviction notice. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the looming stench of betrayal. Across the gravel driveway, parked arrogantly on my grass, was Ansgar's midnight black Porsche. He leaned against the hood, his smartphone held high, recording what he believed was the final collapse of my life. "Hurry it up, Conster," Ansgar yelled, his voice cutting through the crisp air like a jagged blade. "The demolition crew is on a clock. Get that old man out of my house." Beside him stood Gisela, my daughter. She wore a pristine white blazer, her arms crossed, watching me with a cold, calculated smirk that suggested she was already spending the millions my house would bring her. They thought they were looking at a broken, senile man. They thought I was a liability to be cleared away like old debris. They were wrong. "Officer Conster," I said, my voice resonating with the authority of a man who had commanded billion-dollar oil rigs in the heart of the North Sea. "Before you proceed with this illegal circus, I want you to hear exactly how my loving daughter spent her evening." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands were as steady as a surgeon's. I tapped the screen once, activating the heavy-duty Bluetooth speaker I had hidden among the ferns on the porch. Suddenly, the quiet neighborhood was shattered. Gisela's voice, amplified and crystal clear, erupted across the lawn. "Once the police drag him out, dump him in that cheap state facility." The recording hissed, echoing against the neighboring houses. "And Ansgar, cancel his premium heart medications. He's 70. Without those pills, his heart will give out in a month. We keep the money, they level the house, and we are finally free." The silence that followed was deafening. Conster froze, his face turning a sickly shade of grey. Neighbors stepped onto their porches, their faces twisted in horror. Across the street, the smirk vanished from Gisela's face, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. Ansgar lunged for his car door, his bravado evaporating, but I wasn't finished. "That's not all, officer," I said, stepping to the edge of the porch. I looked directly at Ansgar, whose hand was shaking as he fumbled with his car keys. "You think you own this land because you tricked me into signing a piece of paper. You failed to perform a basic structural analysis of the title." I raised my voice so every witness on the street could hear. In October 2018, I established an irrevocable blind trust. I transferred the total ownership of this entire estate into that trust. I am a passive beneficiary with the right to live here until I die, but I do not have the legal power to sell, mortgage, or transfer this land to anyone, including you. I paused, letting the weight of my words crush them. That quitclaim deed you filed, it's a void instrument. It's a useless piece of trash. And when you took that worthless paper to a federal bank to secure a €2.8 million loan, you didn't just lie to me. You committed massive federal bank fraud. The realization hit Ansgar like a physical blow. He slumped against the Porsche, his legs buckling. At that exact moment, the low, guttural roar of heavy engines tore through the street. 3 black, unmarked SUVs screeched around the corner, sealing the exits in a synchronized tactical blockade. A dozen agents in tactical vests emblazoned with BKA swarmed the driveway. My lawyer, Wolfram, stepped out of the lead vehicle, adjusting his tie with a grim look of satisfaction. Ansgar Sutton, Gisela Albrecht. The lead agent barked as they slammed my son-in-law against the hood of his own car. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, federal bank fraud, and aggravated wire fraud." "Daddy, please?" Gisela screamed as the metallic click of handcuffs snapped shut around her wrists. She collapsed onto the asphalt, her expensive blazer staining in the dirt, begging for the mercy she had so ruthlessly denied me. I looked down at her from my porch, my face a mask of zero emotion. "My daughter died the moment she decided my life was worth less than a luxury car and a strip mall," I said, my voice cold and final. "Enjoy your new life in a cell." I watched as they were shoved into the back of the SUVs, their pathetic cries fading as the sirens began to wail. The trap I had meticulously engineered had snapped shut with lethal precision. 6 months have passed since that morning. The wheels of justice ground them into dust. Both Gisela and Ansgar were sentenced to 25 years in a federal penitentiary, with no chance of early parole. The bank seized every asset they had, the Porsche, their townhouse, even her designer bags, to recover the stolen funds. As for me, I realized I couldn't stay in a house that echoed with the whispers of such a foul betrayal. I dissolved the trust and sold the estate to an ethical developer for €5.5 million. I left the cold winters of Munich behind and moved to a penthouse in Miami, where the Atlantic sun washes away the bitter memories of the past. But my final victory wasn't the money or the view. I used a significant portion of the sale to establish the Martha Albrecht Medical Foundation, named after my late wife. We provide life-saving heart medication to the elderly who can't afford it, ensuring that no one else is ever left vulnerable to the greed of those who should love them most. I stand on my balcony now, the sea salt breeze pulling at my shirt, finally at peace. I faced the predators in my own bloodline, and I neutralized the threat. I protected my legacy, and I took control of my narrative. Narrator's advice: sometimes the most dangerous predators don't break in through your window. They have keys to the front door and call you family. Society tells us to forgive our children unconditionally, but there is a profound difference between a mistake and a calculated crime. Forgiveness is a virtue, but protecting your dignity and your hard-earned legacy is a duty. Never hand over the keys to your survival to anyone. Love your family, but love yourself enough to let the law handle those who wear the mask of a demon. Thank you for following the story of Albrecht's intelligent revenge. If you found this story dramatic and meaningful, please hit like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next shocking stories of justice. Goodbye, and see you again.
She was born to get away. Hear that two-tone humming, headed out to the highway. I should have seen it coming, for the years left in the dust.